Welcome to the 88th Henry George Daily Devotional. We have completed going through the canons of taxation. Um, yeah, we decided it was equal, certain, cheap and easy, and it doesn't mess up production. The four canons of taxation. What could be better? All right, we begin chapter 4, endorsements and objections. This is still in book 8, which is application of the remedy. The grounds from which we have drawn the conclusion that the tax on land values or rent is the best method of raising public revenues have been admitted expressly or tacitly by all economists of standing since the determination of the nature and law of rent. Yeah, this is the crazy thing. Even even growing up, like being a fan of Milton Friedman, and he said that he thought that the old Henry George idea of a tax on land rent is the least bad tax. I just totally missed how important it was. Ricky Ricardo says in chapter 10, a tax on rent would fall wholly on landlords and could not be shifted to any class of consumers, for it would leave unaltered the difference between the produce obtained from the least productive land in cultivation and that obtained from land of every other quality. I think BBB is like ... maybe, I don't know. A tax on rent would not discourage the cultivation of fresh land, for such land pays no rent and would be untaxed. McCulloch, good old McCulloch, note XXIV 24. To Wealth of Nations declares that in a practical point of view, taxes on the rent of land are among the most unjust and impolitic that can be imagined. But he makes this assertion solely on the ground of his assumption that it is practically impossible to distinguish in taxation between the sum paid for the use of the soil and that paid on account of the capital expended upon it, meaning the structure generally, or the farm work done on it. Uh, you know, it would be nice when quoting him to see that connection made, but oh well. I I guess I trust George's interpretation of McCulloch. George continues, but supposing that this separation could be effected, McCulloch, admits that the sum paid to landlords for the use of the natural powers of the soil might be entirely swept away by a tax without their having it in their power to throw any portion of the burden upon anyone else, and without affecting the price of produce. So George claims that McCulloch has this issue that you cannot figure out the correct amount to charge for land value because it's just too hard to tell the difference between land and the capital expended upon it. But I guess George says that McCulloch says that if you could tell the difference between land value and capital value, structure value, then you could tax just the land value, and that would not affect the price of produce, and it would not be in a landlord's power to throw any portion of that tax burden upon anyone else, i.e., their tenants. John Stuart Mill not only admits all this, but expressly declares the expediency and justice of a peculiar tax on rent, asking what right the landlords have to the accession of riches that comes to them from the general progress of society without work, risk, or economizing on their part. And although he expressly disapproves of interfering with their claim to the present value of land, he proposes to take the whole future increase as belonging to society by natural right. He disapproves with interfering with their claim to the present. Yes, Mill was um I think that was the one who was suggesting we buy out all of the landlords and then future increases would be taxed. Mrs. Fawcett, in the little compendium of the writings of her husband entitled Political Economy for Beginners, says, just checking how big this, I don't know if we'll make it all the way through. The land tax, whether small or great in amount, partakes of the nature of a rent paid by the owner of land to the state. In a great part of India the land is owned by the government, and therefore the land tax is rent paid direct to the state. The economic perfection of this system of tenure may be readily perceived. I know I was just reading about the whole housing crisis in uh, Mumbai. Wait, is Mumbai still called? Wait. Yeah, it used to be called Bombay. In fact, that rent should, both on grounds of expediency and justice, be the peculiar subject of taxation, is involved in the accepted doctrine of rent, and may be found in embryo in the works of all economists who have accepted the law of Ricardo. Yes, expedient and just. That these principles have not been pushed to their necessary conclusions as I have pushed them, evidently arises from the indisposition to endanger or offend the enormous interest involved in private ownership in land, and from the false theories in regard to wages and the cause of poverty which have dominated economic thought. But there has been a school of economists who plainly perceive what is clear to the natural perceptions of men when uninfluenced by habit. Habit. Habitual. Habitual. So these economists who were not influenced by habit plainly perceive that the revenues of the common property land ought to be appropriated to the common service. Common property, common service. The French economists of the last century, headed by Cunet and Turgot, I think these are the physiocrats, the French physiocrats with their impot unique. Watch this. French, Fremen, French, French physiocrats, who Francois Cunet, the Marquis de Mirabeau, and Robert Jacques Turgot. I don't know, maybe it's Turgot, but I think I'm going to go with Turgot. Dominated the movement which immediately preceded the first modern school of classical economics, which began with the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was published the year America declared independence. But here we will find the impot. No? Oh, no. Impot unique. I don't know how to spell it. Impot unique. Impot unique. Hmm. Physiocrats and the impot unique. Who is this? That's Kunai. The economical table. Subsequent developments. The ideas of the physiocrats had influence on Smith, Ricardo, Mill, and above all, George, who appears at first to have come to similar beliefs independently. George was the driving force behind the single tax movement. Not because of flat. No, no, do not confuse it with the flat tax. Single tax produces annual. Redirected from impot unique. Hmm. Could have sworn I read about it on Wikipedia, but that's alright. Physiocrats, they came up with the impot unique. I don't know. Yes, from the indisposition to endanger or offend the enormous interest involved in private ownership in land, and from the false theories in regard to wages and the cause of poverty which have dominated economic thought. But there has been a school of economists who plainly perceived what is clear to the natural perceptions of men when uninfluenced by habit. Yeah, okay, that's where we were. Revenues of common property, common service. French economists Cunet and Turgot proposed just what I have proposed, that all taxation should be abolished save a tax upon the value of land. Impôt unique. As I am acquainted with the doctrines of Cunet and his disciples only at second hand through the medium of the English writers, George doesn't speak French, I am unable to say how far his peculiar ideas as to agriculture being the only productive avocation. I wonder when we got rid of the A, etc., are erroneous apprehensions or mere peculiarities of terminology. I see. So it seems like Cunet really valued land only for its agricultural values, unless that is a poor translation. Nonetheless, George wants to make sure that agriculture is not considered the only productive vocation, or whatever avocation is. A hobby or minor occupation. Well, I think maybe it has a different meaning in antiquity. But of this I am certain, George writes, from the proposition in which his theory culminated, that he saw the fundamental relation between land and labor which has since been lost sight of, and that he arrived at practical truth, though it may be through a course of defectively expressed reasoning. The causes which leave in the hands of the landlord a produce net were by the physiocrats no better explained than the suction of a pump was explained by the assumption that nature abhors a vacuum. I wonder, I mean, what does it mean, nature abhors a vacuum? How does, I mean, clearly a vacuum means you're going to have a pressure gradient. And so whatever fluid is around will flow. But the fact in its practical relations to social economy was recognized, and the benefit which would result from the perfect freedom given to industry and trade by a substitution of a tax on rent for all the impositions which hamper and distort the application of labor was doubtless as clearly seen by them as it is by moi. One of the things most to be regretted about the French Revolution is that it overwhelmed the ideas of the economists just as they were gaining strength among the thinking classes and were apparently about to influence fiscal legislation. Well, that's kind of wild to think about. The French Revolution was hit just a little too soon. But I don't really know what government was installed by the French Revolution. I don't really know much about I don't know much about France in general, to be honest. After the French Revolution, you had the First Republic, it says. Where's the aftermath? Aftermath is a funny term. I don't know about reading about the French Revolution right now. Moi. Just as they were gaining strength, about to influence fiscal legislation. Without knowing anything of Cunet or his doctrines, I have reached the same practical conclusion by a route which cannot be disputed, and have based it on grounds which cannot be questioned by the accepted political economy. Yes, it drives me nuts. Accepted political economy cannot fight it, and yet Noah Opinion and others who know about Georgism just ignore it. I guess in a somewhat liberal world where we no longer believe in divine right, bloodlines, in a world where everyone pays lip service to the equality of man. If you want to be a tyrant and you can't win the theoretical battle, what is your other option? You just have to ignore it. If you want to perpetuate landlord and land monopoly, you just got to ignore it. The only objection to the tax, or you talk about, oh, it'd be way too hard, on rent or land values, which is to be met with in standard politico-economic works, is one which concedes its advantages, for it is that from the difficulty of separation. Well, I guess the other option is to go all the way, whatever that means. I don't consider it a spectrum really, but that's what a lot of people might say, to advocate completely for socialism or communism. From the difficulty of separation, we might, in taxing the rent of land, tax something else. Oh, not the complaint I thought. McCulloch, for instance, declares taxes on the rent of land to be impolitic and unjust because the return received for the natural and inherent powers of the soil cannot be clearly distinguished from the return received from improvements and meliorations. Oh, I've heard of ameliorating. Yeah. The act of relieving ills or changing for the better. Okay. Which might thus be discouraged. Yeah, okay, so this would be a theoretical, which is similar It's too hard. Yeah, this is basically, oh, it's too hard to assess land value as distinct from property, but we already tried that. Macaulay somewhere says that if the admission of the attraction of gravitation, so if gravity were inimical to any considerable pecuniary interests, there would not be wanting arguments against gravity. That's funny. Uh, a truth of which this objection is an illustration. For admitting that it is impossible invariably to separate the value of land from the value of improvements, is this necessity of continuing to tax some improvements any reason why we should continue to tax all improvements? That's good. Like if you're going to tell me it's too hard to tax just land and not also improvements, and then you're going to say, so what we should do, you're going to say, let's just tax improvements because it's too hard to do land and improvements. I don't buy it. George doesn't buy it. George says, might as well do the crappy version where we do land plus improvements rather than the seriously bad version where we tax all improvements. If it discouraged production to tax values which labor and capital have intimately combined with that of land, how much greater discouragement is involved in taxing not only these, but all the clearly distinguishable values which labor and capital create. But as a matter of fact, the value of land can always be readily distinguished from the value of improvements. In countries like the United States, there is much valuable land that has never been improved. And in many of the states, the value of the land and the value of improvements are habitually estimated separately by the assessors, though afterward reunited under the term real estate. Wonder, yeah. Should look up, I've looked up the etymology of real in real estate before, but I do not remember. Nor where ground has been occupied from immemorial times is there any difficulty in getting at the value of the bare land. For frequently the land is owned by one person, and the buildings by another, and when a fire occurs and improvements are destroyed, a clear and definite value remains in the land. In the oldest country in the world, no difficulty whatever can attend the separation, if all that be attempted is to separate the value of the clearly distinguishable improvements made within a moderate period from the value of the land, should they be destroyed. And this was coincidentally, before I ever studied Georgism, I worked as a home insurance appraiser, where my job was to determine how much it would cost to replace a house. So if you knew how much the whole piece of real estate, the land plus the house, sold for, you could subtract the replacement cost and be left with the land cost. This is one method of determining land value, but it is definitely not the method I most advocate for, because it does rely on individual housing assessments, and it has all of the inaccuracy, or inaccuracy, I suppose, that our current property assessment tax has, which is it's just really hard to accurately determine what it would cost to rebuild a particular structure. Anyway, George writes, this manifestly is all that justice or policy requires. Absolute accuracy is impossible in any system, and to attempt to separate all that the human race has done from what nature originally provided would be as absurd as impracticable. A swamp drained or a bill terraced by the Romans constitutes now as much a part of the natural advantages of the British Isles as though the work had been done by earthquake or glacier. The fact that after a certain lapse of time the value of such permanent improvements would be considered as having lapsed into that of the land and would be taxed accordingly, could have no deterrent effect on such improvements, for such works are frequently undertaken upon leases for years. The fact is that each generation builds and improves for itself and not for the remote future. Yes, we are selfish in a perfectly fine way. And the further fact is that each generation is heir not only to the natural powers of the earth, but to all that remains of the work of past generations. An objection of a different kind may, however, be made. It may be said that where political power is diffused, it is highly desirable that taxation should fall not on one class, such as landowners, but on all, in order that all who exercise political power may feel a proper interest in economical government. Taxation and representation, it will be said, cannot safely be divorced. And that's what we'll talk about next time. For today, we are contenting ourselves that land values can be determined distinctly from improvements. It will not be 100% accurate. No system ever was, but it will be far superior than any other system we've done. All right. See you next time. HEDD 88. Book 8, Chapter 4. Start. Wake up, hard drive. Alright. 1 million listeners. No. Alright. 88, Book 8, Chapter 4. The LVT, land value, can be determined better than non-land value. Sort of. It's kind of one and the same. Fairly and accurately enough. Oh, what was this? IVI. I typed that wrong. Endorsements and objections. Endorsements. All the economists agree LVT is best. Some say land value can't be determined accurately, but George says this is no problem, really. Okay. That is the title. That is all my linkies. Slinky Linkies 188. Ay, ay, ay. YouTube. I to be. Yes. Upload video. Alright, we did it.